Hi, I'm Yoon Han, majoring in English education. Let's start the presentation. There are two parts and each part has 6 steps and 8 steps. First, step 1, take smart notes. First, what can you do that? Carnupper says, always attend the class and you take good notes once you're there. The reason is to reduce your study time because you know exactly what the professor is focusing on. It means the professor is your examiner. Then how can you do that? He says, collect the right materials. And second, Carnupper says, identify the big idea. The reason is professors require you explain the big idea, contrast them, and re-evaluate them in the light of new evidence. Then how can you do that? He says, capture big ideas by using the question, evidence, conclusion. Next, Carney says the key to taking notes in a technical courses is to make a note as many simple problems as possible. The reason is these sample problems will prove to be your most important resource. How can you do that? He says, prioritize your note taking. Next, step 2, demote your assignment. First, Carney says smart students avoid day before task plans by constantly performing tasks because large assignments will quickly transform from potentially interesting to tedious to painful when tackled in one monolithic last-minute chunk for time. How can you do that? He says if you have a problem set due every week, complete one problem a day, 1 hour at a time. Next, 2. Carnier says don't read all of the books because sometimes you are simply given more pages to cover than you have hours in the day to complete. Then how can you do that? He says, always read the assignments from for favored sources. Next, Carnier says the core of the strategy is that all big ideas can be reduced to question, evidence, and conclusions. Because the best compromise is to use a strategy similar to the one outlined earlier for taking lecture notes. Then, how can you do that? He says, skim the entire reading. Move on 4. Carney says, don't work on the problem set alone. Solve the problem on the go and write solution right the first time. Because if you spread out your work, you will end up spending fewer hours on the assignments than if you try to do it all at once. Then how can you do that? He says identify 1 or 2 students who share a similar skill level as you. Step 3, marshal your resources. First, Carney says you must first determine the scope of the test. Brown says it is reason that you need to know what kind of information the professor wants you to know. Then how can you do that? Carnioper says if it's 2 weeks before the exam and the professor hasn't mentioned any details yet, you should ask. Move on. 2. Carnioper says once you find out which lectures and reading assignments are fair game for the exam, print out the corresponding notes that you've typed up the collect the pages you've written. He says cluster these pages into piles and separated by general topic. Because he says since you will be moving to and from your various isolated study space once you begin your review. 3. Carnioper says many students follow the various running guide approaches that focus on sample problems because your problem set assignments are the key to your review process. Then how can you do that? It says start a pile for each problem set that covers materials that might appear on the exam. Step 4. Concord the material. First, Carnioper says the most effective way to imprint a concept is to first review it and then try to explain it in your own words. The reason why, if you do that, you have fully imprinted that concept. Then, how can you do that? He says you need to construct a practice quiz for each chapter in your study guide. Move on. Next. Carnioper says you just need to keep studying with your flashcards until you can provide the right answer because memorization is particularly dependent on your available mental energy. Then, how can you do that? He says it does work if you memorize only 1 hour at a time and only 1 or 2 hours a day. Step 5. Invest in academic disaster insurance. First, Carnioper says the key is to start this process well before the exam. Because if you leave all of these question marks unanswered until you start studying, if you will end up spending many extra hours looking up the required explanations. Then, how can you do that? He says ask questions during the class. Next, step 6, provide A+ answers. First, Carnioper says, in the first place, you should always be to review all of the questions, because this review familiarize you with the length and relative difficulty of what lies ahead. Then, how can you do that? He says if the exam is multiple choice or contains many questions, skim through quickly and get a feel for which topics are covered. Next, 2. Carnioper says during an exam, you should recognize the maximum number of minutes you need to spend on the question before moving on to the next. Because this strategy goes a long way toward avoiding time trouble. Then how can you do that? He says first, take the time allotted for the exam and subtract 10 minutes. Next, Divide this amount by the number of questions. Move on. 3. Carney says start with the most easy questions before moving on to the more forbidding, because it also gives you a better chance of conquering the more difficult ones. Then how can you do that? He says you've answered everything else, so all that's left to do is working out this final puzzler. Next, 4. Carney says in the first place, you have to write down a brief overview first, because just starting writing leads to rambling answers and missed concepts. Then how can you do that? He says reread the question carefully. Next, 5. Carney says if you have extra time at the end of the exam, go back and check your answer, because you will be surprised by how many times this final review turns up a mistake in a technical problem or an important concept there that you forgot to mention in an essay. Then how can you do that? He says if there is a problem you feel particularly unstable, use this time to go over it in detail. Detail, reinforcing the answer whenever appropriate. Next, part 3, step 1, targeting a titillating topic. First, Carney says the key is to decide a topic that excites you within the limitation on the assignment, because all work that follows on your paper will stem from this topic. Then, how can you do that? He says the best way to identify a titillating topic is to start looking for one early. Next, step 2, conduct a thesis hunting expedition. Chris says that he usually starts with general sources. The main reason you found these general sources is to get at their bibliographies. Then, how can you do that? Carney says you need to start general parts of the strategy. Next, step 3, seek a second opinion. Leo says that he often talks to professor to check his idea before he starts to writing. The reason is when you talks to a professor, you will have confidence in the foundation of your paper. Then, how can you do that? Carney says that go to office hour or make an appointment, explain your topic and thesis. Next, step 4, research like a machine. First, Carney says there are 2 strategies. First, the first strategy is to begin with general sources and then check in their bibliographies for more targeted resources. The second one, for finding specific sources, is to look for them directly. Because for a college level paper, most of your best information is going to come paper. Then how can you do that? Carney says break up your query into general chunks. Next, 2. Carney says make a photocopy or print out of all appropriate material, because these hard copies are portable. Then how can you do that? It says photocopy each source's bibliographies. Next, 3. He says you needed to review the sources and comment them with a simple description of the important information. Because if you don't know what information it contains and how it might be useful to your paper, a stack of photocopied pages is worthless. Then how can you do that? Read through the sources quickly. Next, Carney says there is a need for approximate procedures to help determine whether sufficient research has been collected. Because at this early stage, you probably don't know exactly how your thesis argument will proceed. So you don't know exactly what information you need. Then how can you do that? He says, list the topics that might help you support your thesis. Next, step 5, craft a powerful story. Carney says formulating a solid argument cannot be reduced to a system because it is a mental exercise that requires critical thinking and creativity. Then how can you do that? He says describe your argument in a topping level outline. Next, step 6, consult your expert panel. Carney says decide your expert panel. And the more important the paper, the more people who should review it. Because the size of your expert panel should be directly proportional to the importance of the assignment. Then, how can you do that? He says your number one pick should be your professor. Next, step 7, write without the agony. Carney says separate your research from your writing and your writing from your adding. Because a fresh mind produces better research. Then how can you do that? Jeremy from Dartmouth says having time away from the paper allows you to come at it with better concentration. Next, 2. Carney says step back to the corner of a quiet building far away for writing. Because writing requires substantial concentration. Then how can you do that? He says you should schedule your writing to correspond to your energetic high points during the day. Next, 3. Chris says he used the outline he made as a guide and accepts one paragraph at a time. The reason is moving fast tends to produce time-consuming dead ends later on, and ultimately necessitates major rewriters. Then how can you do that? He says always make sure your current point reads clearly before moving on to the next. Next, step 8, fix, don't fix it. First, Carney says read the paper carefully on your computer to make sure your argument is clear, correct obvious error, and rewrite the part where the follow needs to be improved. Second, the out loud pass. He says, carefully read out loud a printed copy of your paper to express an awkward phrase or unclear explanation. Third, the sanity pass. It says finally pass through the printed version of the paper to check the overall follow and eliminate the reminding error. Thank you.